Matthew Sandoval thought he was just going to feed his horse. He had no idea he was about to walk into a mystery that would not only shatter the quiet, lonely peace he'd built for himself, but would also unearth the ghosts he thought he'd buried 5 years ago. It all started with a sound that didn't belong. Out there on the sprawling, empty plains of northern Texas, you get to know the sounds. The whisper of the wind through the dried grass, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of the windmill. But this sound was different. It was the quick, shallow breathing of something small and terrified. Matthew set down the bucket of oats, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the knife he always wore on his belt. At 37, he was a man carved from the harsh landscape itself, weathered, quiet, and tough. He'd learned long ago that anything out of the ordinary on his 3,000-acre ranch, the Silent Heart, could mean trouble. It could be a wounded coyote, which was bad. Or it could be bandits, which was a whole lot worse. He moved toward the barn, his footsteps silent in the dust. The sun was bleeding out across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. But Matthew didn't notice the beauty. His entire being was focused on that sound, the sound of pure, primal fear. He pushed the heavy barn door open. It groaned on its hinges, a sound that usually meant comfort in the end of a long day. Tonight, it sounded like a warning. The inside of the barn was thick with shadows, smelling of hay, leather, and something else. Something metallic and sharp, the scent of blood. The breathing grew louder, faster, coming from the far corner, behind a stack of hay bales. "Anybody in here?" Matthew called out, his voice low and steady, the same voice he used to calm a spooked horse. He didn't want to startle whatever, or whoever, was hiding in his barn. There was no answer, just that frantic, hitched breathing. He reached for the kerosene lantern by the door, his fingers sure and steady as he struck a match. The flame caught, casting a warm, golden glow that pushed back the darkness. He lifted the lantern high, its light spilling across the dusty floor, over the saddles and tools and into the corner. And that's when he saw her. He thought it was an animal. He was wrong. It was so much worse. Crouched in the corner, trying to make herself as small as possible, was a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 19, but her eyes held the haunted look of someone who had lived 1,000 lifetimes of pain. She was Apache, her deerskin dress torn and caked with mud and dried blood. Her black hair was a tangled mess, and her body was coiled like a spring, ready to bolt or fight at any moment. But the thing that stopped Matthew's heart cold was her gaze. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the ground, her chin tucked so tightly against her chest it looked painful, as if she was physically incapable of looking up, as if the world and everyone in it was too terrifying to face. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, not from the cold October wind, but from a terror so profound it seemed to have settled deep into her bones. "It's all right," Matthew said, his voice barely a whisper. He immediately lowered the lantern, not wanting to blind her. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe here." She flinched at the sound of his voice, pressing herself even harder against the wooden wall, as if trying to become one with the shadows. He could see the raw, desperate panic in her. He'd seen it before, in wild horses that had been broken with cruelty instead of patience. This was a person who had been shattered. "My name is Matthew," he said, keeping his distance. "This is my ranch. You're welcome to stay." He didn't take another step forward. Instead, he did something unexpected. He slowly sat down on the dusty floor, right where he was, a good 20 feet away from her. He made himself smaller, less of a threat. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "I can get you some food, some water." For the first time she moved. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Her eyes never left the dirt floor. "Okay," Matthew said, his voice soft. "I'm going to the house to get you something. I'll be right back. You can stay right here. No one will bother you." He stood up slowly, making sure his movements were slow and predictable. He didn't want to give her any reason to bolt. As he turned to leave, he felt her eyes on his back. He could feel the weight of her fear, her suspicion. He walked out of the barn and into the fading light, his mind racing. Who was she? What had happened to her? And who were the monsters that had done this to a young woman and left her so broken she couldn't even look another person in the eye? He went into his small, quiet house, the house that had been silent for 5 long years, ever since he'd lost his wife, Elena, and their unborn son. He moved with purpose, grabbing warm tortillas, beans, cheese, and a pitcher of cold well water. He also grabbed a clean, soft blanket from the chest where he still kept Elena's things. He didn't know why, but it felt right. When he returned to the barn, she was exactly where he'd left her, a statue carved from fear. "I brought you some food," he said, placing the tray on the ground, halfway between them. He didn't want to crowd her. "And a blanket. It gets cold in here at night." He backed away again, sitting in his original spot, giving her all the space in the world. For what felt like an eternity, she didn't move. Then slowly, cautiously, like a fawn approaching a stream, she crept forward. She ate with a desperate, controlled hunger that spoke of days, maybe weeks of starvation. She didn't tear at the food. She took small, deliberate bites, but she didn't stop until the plate was clean. She drank the water with the same quiet intensity. When she was finished, a long silence settled between them, broken only by the sound of the wind outside. "What's your name?" Matthew asked gently. He waited. The silence stretched. He thought she wouldn't answer. Then a voice so quiet it was like the rustling of leaves whispered a single word. "Kitlali." "Kitlali." Matthew repeated the name. It was beautiful. He knew enough of the local dialects to know it meant star. He looked at the trembling girl huddled in the corner of his barn and thought that no name had ever been less fitting. Her light had been violently extinguished. "That's a beautiful name. Ponanen Tamanadinan," he said softly. And that's when she started to cry. Silent tears streamed down her face, but she made no sound. She didn't lift her head, didn't wipe them away. It was as if the simple act of hearing her own name, spoken with kindness, had cracked open the dam that was holding back a river of pain. "Can you tell me what happened?" Matthew asked, his voice gentle. "You don't have to. Only if you want to." She hugged her knees tighter, making herself even smaller. Her voice was a broken whisper, forced out from a place of deep trauma. "Bad men," she breathed. "They took me." Her words were fragmented, shattered pieces of a horrific story. "Weeks ago, maybe months. I don't know. They said they were going to sell me." Her voice hitched, and a wave of shudders racked her small frame. "Last night, they were drinking. I ran. I ran all night. I just saw your light." A cold, hard fury began to burn in Matthew's gut. It was a feeling he hadn't felt in years, a protective rage he thought had died with Elena. He wanted to hunt these men down. He wanted to make them pay for every tear, every shudder, every ounce of fear they had poured into this young woman. But he pushed it down. Vengeance wouldn't help her now. She didn't need a warrior. She needed a safe harbor. "Did they hurt you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and ugly. She didn't answer with words. She didn't have to. The way she curled into herself, the way a fresh wave of trembling seized her, it was answer enough. He closed his eyes, his fists clenching. He had to be calm. For her. "Kitlali," he said, his voice a low anchor in her storm. He waited until he saw her head move slightly, a sign she was listening. "I want you to listen to me very carefully. You are safe here. Do you understand? No one is going to hurt you on my land. No one." She didn't respond, but the trembling in her shoulders seemed to lessen, just a fraction. "I know you have no reason to trust me," he continued, speaking from the heart. "I know you're probably scared of all men right now. I get it. I'm not going to ask for your trust. I'm not going to ask you to look at me or talk to me or do anything that makes you feel unsafe." He paused, choosing his next words with the care of a man disarming a bomb. "But I will make you a promise. I will wait, no matter how long it takes. There are no expectations here. Just a safe place for you to heal." For the first time, she lifted her head, not enough to meet his eyes, but enough for him to see her profile in the lantern light. He saw the tracks of tears on her cheeks, the exhaustion etched into her young face, and something else, a flicker of something that might one day become hope. "Why?" she whispered. The single word was loaded with a universe of pain and confusion. Why would a stranger help her? Why would anyone be kind in a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty? Matthew thought about how to answer. He could tell her about Elena. He could tell her about the gaping hole in his own life, about the crushing loneliness of this big empty ranch. He could tell her that in saving her, maybe he was trying to save a piece of himself, but he didn't. He gave her a simpler, more powerful truth. Because everyone deserves a chance to heal, he said, and because I know what it's like to feel broken. The admission hung in the air between them. It was a piece of his own pain, offered as a bridge to hers, and for a fleeting second, her eyes flickered up, not quite meeting his, but looking in his direction for the first time. She was seeing him, not just as a man, a potential threat, but as something else, a fellow survivor. You can stay here in the barn, he offered, or there's a room in the house. It has a lock on the inside. You can choose, whatever makes you feel safest. The barn, she whispered immediately. The house was too close, too intimate. The barn was a big open space, a place she could run from. All right, he said. The barn it is. I'll bring you some more blankets. And a pillow. He started to get up, but then he had another idea. An idea that might just be the key. I'll be right back. He returned a few minutes later with the blankets and with Shadow, his old, gentle border collie. Shadow was ancient and slow, but he had a sixth sense about fear. He could calm the most nervous horse with just his quiet presence. This is Shadow, Matthew explained, letting the dog off his leash. He's a good boy. He can stay with you tonight if you like. He's a good watchdog. He'll let you know if anyone comes near. Shadow trotted over to Lolly, not with a boisterous greeting, but with a slow, careful approach. He sniffed her hand, then nudged it with his wet nose before curling up beside her, letting out a soft sigh. To Matthew's astonishment, Lolly reached out a trembling hand and placed it on the dog's back. A tiny bit of the tension left her shoulders. It was the first time he'd seen her connect with another living being. Thank you, she murmured, the words so soft they were almost swallowed by the wind whistling through the cracks in the barn walls. But Matthew heard them, and in that moment he felt a flicker of warmth in his own chest, a feeling he'd thought was long dead. Sleep well, Lolly, he said. We'll be here in the morning. The next few days fell into a fragile routine. Matthew would bring food and water to the barn 3 times a day, always whistling softly to announce his approach. He never got too close, never pushed for conversation. He'd just leave the tray, ask if she needed anything, and then go about his work on the ranch. He spoke to her often, but not in a way that demanded a response. He'd tell her about the horses, about the coming winter, about funny things Shadow had done as a puppy. He filled the silence with his steady, calm voice, giving her an anchor to hold on to without asking for anything in return. Slowly, like a frozen river thawing in the spring, she began to change. She started moving around the barn during the day. He'd catch glimpses of her standing in the doorway, watching him work with the horses in the corral. Her eyes were never on him, always on the animals. But she was watching. She was observing. She was learning. One afternoon, about a week after she'd arrived, he was working with a young colt that had been badly abused by its previous owner. The horse was terrified, shying away from every movement, its eyes wide with panic. Easy now, boy, Matthew murmured, moving slowly, his hands open and non-threatening. Nobody's going to hurt you here. We've got all the time in the world. From the corner of his eye, he saw Lolly watching from the barn door. She'd been there for nearly an hour, silent and still. He's like me, she said suddenly. Her voice, though quiet, was clearer than he'd ever heard it. It startled him, but he didn't turn around. He kept his focus on the skittish horse. How so? He asked, his tone casual. He's afraid, she said. He thinks you're going to hurt him again, so he won't let you get close. You're right, Matthew agreed. He needs to learn that not all hands are meant to harm. He could hear the unspoken question in her words. She wasn't just talking about the horse. She was asking about herself. Do you think he ever will? She asked, her voice a little stronger now. Will he ever trust again? Matthew finally stopped and turned to look at her. She was still in the shadow of the doorway, but she wasn't hiding anymore. She was standing tall. She still wouldn't meet his eyes, but she was facing him. I think so, he said, his voice filled with a conviction that was as much for her as it was for the horse. But it has to be on his terms. You can't force trust. You can only earn it. You just have to be patient and steady and prove that you're safe, day after day after day. He held her gaze for a moment before she looked away. You would do that? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. You would just wait? Kitlali, he said, and his voice was raw with sincerity. For as long as it takes. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but this time she didn't hide it. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, and for the first time, she gave him a small, hesitant nod. It was a tiny gesture, but to Matthew it felt like the sun breaking through the clouds after a long and brutal storm. Something was changing, but he had no idea that the storm was far from over. In fact, it was just about to break. The next morning, Matthew found something that made his blood run cold. While checking the fence line at the far edge of his property, he saw tracks. 3 sets of shod horses heading east. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that they had stopped at his fence line. And one set of footprints showed a man had dismounted, walked a few feet onto his property, and then returned to his horse. They were scouting him. They were watching his ranch. He felt a knot of ice form in his stomach. They knew she was here, or at least they suspected. He raced back to the barn, his heart pounding in his chest. Kitlali! He called out as he ran. She was sweeping the floor, a small domestic act that seemed so normal it almost broke his heart. She looked up, startled, and saw the look on his face. The color drained from hers. What is it? We have to talk, he said, his voice grim. He told her about the tracks. He watched as the fragile shell of calm she had built around herself began to crack. The terror came rushing back into her eyes. They found me, she whispered, her voice trembling again. They're coming. They're not going to get you, Matthew said, his voice hard as iron. But we need a plan. We need a place for you to hide, a place they'll never find. Together they worked all day. In the darkest corner of the barn, under a pile of old hay, was a section of the floor that was loose. Years ago, Matthew had used it as a small root cellar. It wasn't much, just a dark, cramped hole in the ground, but it was hidden. They cleared it out, made it as comfortable as they could with blankets, and created a small trap door that was almost invisible once covered with hay. If they come, Matthew instructed, his hands on her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. You get in here. You don't make a sound. You don't come out, not for anything. Do you understand me? She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. But what about you? Don't you worry about me, he said, his jaw tight. I can handle a few lowlifes. But even as he said it, he knew he was lying. He was one man. If they were determined, there was only so much he could do. He spent the rest of the day cleaning his rifle and his shotgun, making sure they were loaded and ready. The peaceful quiet of his ranch had been shattered. Now it was a waiting game. They didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, they appeared on the horizon, a cloud of dust that slowly resolved into 3 riders. They weren't moving with the easy pace of travelers. They were riding hard, with a grim purpose that made the hairs on the back of Matthew's neck stand up. They're here, he said, his voice low. He saw Kitlali's face go white. Go, he commanded. Now! She didn't hesitate. She scrambled into the hiding spot, and Matthew quickly covered the trap door with hay, erasing any sign that it was ever there. He grabbed his shotgun from beside the barn door and stood in the entrance, waiting. He tried to project an air of calm, of a simple rancher confused by the sudden arrival of strangers. But inside, his heart was hammering against his ribs. The 3 men rode into his yard and reined in their horses. They looked hard and mean, the kind of men who live by violence and intimidation. The man in the lead, a big bearded man with a nasty scar across his cheek and cold dead eyes, swung down from his saddle. Afternoon, the man said, his voice a gravelly rumble. Name's Buck Morrison. We're looking for something that belongs to us. That a fact? Matthew replied, his voice level. He kept the shotgun held loosely at his side, but his finger was near the trigger. And what might that be? Morrison's eyes scanned the ranch, taking in the house, the corral, the barn. His gaze lingered on the barn for a moment too long. An Apache girl, he said, his lips curling into a sneer. Ran off a few weeks back. We tracked her this far, then the trail went cold. You ain't seen a stray Indian girl wandering around, have you? Can't say that I have, Matthew said, his face a mask of indifference. Lots of folks pass through this territory. Hard to keep track. This one's different, Morrison said, taking a step closer. His two companions stayed on their horses, their hands resting on their pistols. She's valuable property. Her owner wants her back, and he's willing to pay a reward. No questions asked. Matthew felt a surge of disgust. They spoke of her as if she were a piece of livestock. Sorry I can't help you, he said, shifting his weight. Now, if you don't mind, I've got work to do. I don't think you understand, Morrison said, his voice losing its friendly veneer. It turned cold and sharp, like a shard of ice. We ain't asking. We have reason to believe she's on your property, and we're authorized to search. Authorized by who? Matthew challenged, his grip tightening on the shotgun. By the man who owns her, Morrison spat. And out here, that's all the authorization we need. The threat was naked now, hanging in the air between them. Matthew knew he was at a crossroads. He could let them search, and they would tear his place apart until they found her. Or he could fight. It was 3 against 1. The odds were not in his favor. But the thought of handing Kilali over to these animals, it wasn't an option. I'm going to have to ask you to leave my land, Matthew said, his voice low and dangerous. He brought the shotgun up, holding it loosely but ready. Morrison laughed, a short, ugly sound. You in what army, old man? This army, a new voice cut in. The voice was calm, steady, and came from the direction of the house. Morrison and his men spun around. Standing on the porch of Matthew's house was his neighbor, Tom Bradley. Tom was a former cavalry sergeant, a man who had seen his share of fights, and he was holding a Winchester rifle, aimed right at Morrison's chest. Standing beside him were his 2 grown sons, each holding a rifle of their own. Morrison's face went from arrogant to furious. He was no longer facing a lone rancher. He was facing 4 armed men who looked like they knew how to use their weapons. This ain't your business, Bradley, Morrison snarled. We're just looking for stolen property. Looks to me like you're trespassing and threatening my friend, Tom said, his voice mild. And around here, we take that personally. I suggest you boys ride on out before you find more trouble than you were looking for. Morrison stared at Tom, then at Matthew, his eyes burning with hatred. He was outnumbered and outgunned, and he knew it. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the wind. Then Morrison slowly backed away and climbed onto his horse. This ain't over, he seethed, glaring at Matthew. That girl is worth a lot of money. We'll be back. And next time, we'll bring more men. He wheeled his horse around and, with his 2 thugs, galloped away, leaving a cloud of angry dust in their wake. Matthew stood there, his shotgun still raised, until they were just a speck on the horizon. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline and the rage. He had won the battle, but he knew Morrison was right. This was far from over. They would be back, and he had a terrible feeling that next time, Tom Bradley and his sons wouldn't be enough. He waited a full hour before he went to the trapdoor. It's safe, he called down. They're gone. Kitlali emerged, blinking in the daylight. She was shaking, but there was a new look on her face. The fear was still there, but it was mixed with something else, a hard, cold fury that mirrored his own. They will never stop, she said, her voice stronger than he'd ever heard it. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a grim, undeniable fact. As long as I am alive, they will hunt me. Then we'll have to make sure they can't touch you, Matthew replied, his mind already working, turning over a desperate, crazy idea that had been forming in the back of his mind ever since Morrison had called her property. How? She asked, her eyes searching his face. There's nowhere I can go where they won't find me. Maybe you don't have to go anywhere, he said slowly, the words feeling strange and momentous as he said them. Kitlali, marry me. She stared at him as if he had lost his mind. What? She breathed, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. No, I can't. You don't know what you're asking. Listen to me, he said, his voice urgent. This isn't about, it's not what you think. This is about the law. If you are my wife legally on paper, then you are not property. You are a citizen. No one can claim you. They would have no legal right. It would be a shield. My name would be your shield. A shield? She repeated, shaking her head. Matthew, I cannot be a wife to anyone. Not after I am not whole. I might never be. The pain in her voice was so raw, it was like a physical blow. He reached out, not to touch her, but as if to hold her up with his words alone. I am not asking for a wife in that way, he said, his voice softening. I am not asking for anything you are not ready to give. This would be a partnership, a protection, nothing more. Your room would still be your room. Your life would still be your own. You would just be safer. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, her dark eyes searching his for any hint of a lie, any hidden motive. She saw only a desperate sincerity. She saw a man who was offering her the only thing he had left to give, his name, his protection, without any expectation of anything in return. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of disbelief. Disbelief that such kindness could exist in the world that had shown her so much cruelty. You would do that? She whispered. You would tie yourself to someone so broken? You are not broken, Kitlali, he said, and his voice was fierce with conviction. You are healing, and I meant what I said before. I will wait. If it takes the rest of my life, I will wait. She continued to search his face, and in that long, silent moment, something shifted between them. The barrier of fear and trauma that had separated them began to dissolve, replaced by a fragile, tentative thread of trust. It wasn't love. It wasn't passion. It was something quieter, deeper. It was recognition. Two lonely, wounded souls finding a strange sort of shelter in each other. Okay, she whispered, the word barely audible. I will be your wife. 3 days later, they stood before the territorial judge in the small, dusty town. Tom Bradley and his wife stood as their witnesses. Matthew wore his only clean suit, and Kilali wore a simple dress that Tom's wife had given her. It was a strange, somber affair. The judge, a stern man named Carson, looked at them over his spectacles with a mixture of suspicion and pity. He read the vows in a monotone voice, the words feeling both hollow and incredibly heavy. Do you, Matthew Sandoval, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Matthew looked at Kitlali. She was staring at the floor, her hands twisting in front of her, but she stood straight and tall. I do, he said, his voice clear and strong. And do you, Kitlali, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? There was a long pause. For a heart-stopping moment, Matthew thought she would change her mind. Then she lifted her head, and for the first time, she met his eyes directly. Her gaze was steady, and in their depths, he saw not fear, but a flicker of grim determination. I do, she said, her voice unwavering. They were pronounced man and wife. They signed the papers. And just like that, Kitlali, the runaway Apache girl, ceased to exist. In her place was Mrs. Sandoval, a rancher's wife with all the rights and protections that name afforded. They walked out of the courthouse into the bright Texas sun, not as lovers, but as allies in a war they both knew was far from over. The news of their marriage spread through the small community like wildfire. There were whispers, of course, judgments in the eyes of the townspeople. The women in the general store would stop talking when Kilali entered. The men at the saloon would stare at Matthew with a mixture of pity and contempt. They saw a lonely rancher who had foolishly married an Indian girl. They didn't see the truth. They didn't see the desperate gambit for survival. Matthew and Kitlali ignored them. They returned to the ranch and fell back into their quiet routine. But something had changed. There was a new unspoken bond between them. They were tied together now, not by affection, but by a shared secret and a shared enemy. He still slept in the house, she still slept in the barn. But sometimes in the evening, she would come and sit on the porch steps while he smoked his pipe, and they would watch the stars come out in silence. It was a comfortable silence, a silence that didn't need to be filled with words. A week later, Buck Morrison returned, but he didn't come with guns blazing. He came with a man in a fancy suit and a piece of paper. The man was a lawyer, and the paper was a legal document claiming Kitlali as the property of a wealthy landowner named Silas Blackwood, a man known for his ruthlessness and his vast fortune. "This marriage is a sham," Morrison sneered, standing in Matthew's yard once again. "And this document proves our claim. She belongs to Mr. Blackwood." Judge Carson was with them, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Matthew," the judge said, "this document appears to be legal. It's a bill of sale. It predates your marriage certificate." Matthew's blood ran cold. He had thought the marriage was a fortress, but it seemed they had found a crack in the walls. He looked at Kitlali, who was standing behind him on the porch. The terror was back in her eyes. "She is my wife," Matthew said, his voice low and shaking with rage. "You cannot take a man's wife." "We can and we will," the lawyer said smoothly. "The law is on our side. The girl is property." But then Kitlali did something that surprised them all. She stepped forward, standing beside Matthew. She was no longer the frightened girl from the barn. She was a woman fighting for her life. And she spoke, her voice clear and ringing, with a strength that stunned everyone into silence. "I am not property," she said, looking directly at the lawyer. "And I have proof that this man, Silas Blackwood, is a criminal." She held out her hand. In it was a small leather-bound book. "What is that?" the lawyer asked, his smug expression faltering. "It is his ledger," Kitlali said. "I was his bookkeeper. I was not his slave. I saw what he did. He deals in illegal weapons, in stolen land, in human lives. It's all in here. Every crime, every name, every date." Morrison's face went pale. He lunged for the book, but Matthew was faster. He stepped in front of Kitlali, his hand on the butt of his pistol. "I think you've overstayed your welcome," Matthew said, his voice deadly calm. The lawyer looked from the ledger to Matthew's face, and he knew they had lost. The bill of sale was useless now. That small book held the power to destroy a man like Silas Blackwood. They had come for a piece of property, and they had found a witness who could burn their entire world to the ground. Morrison and the lawyer retreated, their threats and bluster gone, replaced by a very real fear. As they rode away, defeated for a second time, Matthew turned to Kitlali. He was speechless. All this time he had seen her as a victim, someone he needed to protect. He had never imagined the strength she held inside her, the courage. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. "You never asked," she replied simply. "You saw a frightened girl, and you gave her a safe place. You didn't ask for explanations or justifications. You just gave. I did not know if I could trust you with this." She looked at the ledger in her hand. "This is why they hunt me. Not because I am valuable property, but because I know their secrets." That night, everything changed. She finally told him the whole story. She wasn't a random Apache girl captured in a raid. Her name was Kitlali, but she had been raised in a mission school. She was educated. She could read and write in 3 languages. Her skills had gotten her a job as a bookkeeper for the seemingly respectable Silas Blackwood. But she soon discovered the true nature of his business. He was a monster, a kingpin whose empire was built on misery. When she realized the extent of his evil, she knew she had to escape. She copied his most incriminating ledgers into her own small book and fled. They had been hunting her ever since, not to reclaim property, but to silence a witness. The story poured out of her, a torrent of pain and fear and righteous anger. Matthew listened, his respect for her growing with every word. This wasn't a broken girl. This was a warrior. "This changes everything," he said when she was finished. "This ledger, it can bring him down, but it also puts a bigger target on your back, and on mine." "I know," she said, her eyes meeting his. "I am sorry I brought this danger to you." "Don't be," he said, and for the first time he reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, but she didn't pull away. "I chose to stand with you then, and I choose to stand with you now. We're in this together." Holding her hand felt right. It felt like coming home after a long journey. In that moment, their marriage of convenience became something more. It became a true alliance, a partnership forged in shared danger and mutual respect. But they both knew that Silas Blackwood was not a man to be trifled with. He would not send lawyers and thugs next time. He would send an army. The ranch, once a sanctuary, was about to become a battlefield. They didn't have to wait long. The next day, Tom Bradley rode over, his face grim. "Matthew," he said, "there's a group of men gathering in town. Hired guns, at least a dozen of them. They're asking questions about you. Blackwood's put a bounty on Kit Lolly's head, and on anyone who's helping her." The war had come to their doorstep. "Get your family out of here, Tom," Matthew said. "This is my fight." "The hell it is," Tom replied, spitting on the ground. "You're my friend, and that young woman is your wife. We don't abandon our own. Me and the boys will be here." Matthew felt a surge of gratitude, but he also knew it wouldn't be enough. A dozen hired guns against 5 ranchers. The odds were impossible. That night, as they prepared for the inevitable assault, Kit Lolly came to him. She was holding the ledger. "Maybe I should give this to them," she said, her voice heavy with despair. "Maybe I should give myself up. Then no one else will get hurt." "No," Matthew said, his voice fierce. He took her by the shoulders. "We don't give in to monsters like him. We fight. We win or we die. But we do not surrender." He looked into her eyes and he saw not just a partner, not just an ally, but a woman of incredible strength and courage. A woman he was beginning to realize he cared for more than he could have imagined. And in her eyes he saw a reflection of that same feeling. The respect had deepened into something else, something warm and powerful. "I have an idea," he said, his mind racing. "It's a long shot, but it's the only shot we've got." The plan was desperate. It was reckless. It was probably suicidal, but it was better than waiting to be slaughtered. The next morning, Matthew rode into town alone. He walked into the saloon where Blackwood's hired guns were drinking and laughing. The room went silent. Every eye turned to him. "I'm Matthew Sandoval," he announced, his voice ringing through the quiet room. "I hear you're looking for my wife." The leader of the gunslingers, a man with a face like a bulldog, stood up. "That's right," he growled. "Mr. Blackwood is paying a lot of money for her." "Well, you can't have her," Matthew said. The room erupted in murmurs. The gunman looked stunned. "What's the catch?" he asked, suspicious. "The catch," Matthew said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "is that she has a book, a little ledger. It's got all of Mr. Blackwood's dirty secrets in it. I imagine that book is worth a lot more than the bounty on her head. I'm willing to trade the book for our safe passage out of this territory, and a little extra for our troubles." The gunman's eyes lit up with greed. Betraying his boss for a bigger payday was the code of his kind. "How do we know you're not lying?" "You don't," Matthew said, "but you'll find out. Meet me at my ranch at dawn. Come alone. We'll make the exchange." The gunman agreed. Greed had won. Matthew rode back to the ranch, his heart pounding. Phase 1 of his desperate plan was complete. Now came the hard part. That night, under the cover of darkness, Tom Bradley and his sons helped Matthew and Kit Lolly prepare. They weren't preparing for an exchange. They were preparing for an ambush. They dug trenches. They set up barricades. They strategically placed sticks of dynamite, a trick Matthew had learned during a brief stint working for the railroad. The Silent Heart Ranch was no longer a home. It was a fortress. As dawn broke, Matthew saw them coming. But it wasn't just the one gunman. It was all of them. A dozen riders fanned out, their rifles drawn. "He betrayed you," Kit Lolly whispered from the trench beside him. "Of course he did," Matthew replied, his hand steady on his rifle. "I was counting on it." "So what's the plan?" she asked. "The plan," Matthew said with a grim smile, "is to give them a little Texas welcome." The gunmen rode into the yard, their leader shouting for Matthew to come out. "Bring the book and the girl," he yelled, "and maybe we'll let you live." "I've got a better idea," Matthew yelled back, and he gave the signal. Tom Bradley, hidden in the barn loft, lit the first fuse. The dynamite exploded, taking out the front rank of riders and their horses in a cloud of fire and dirt. The remaining gunmen, shocked and confused, started firing wildly. But they were exposed, caught in a crossfire from the trenches, the house, and the barn. It was chaos. It was a slaughter. Matthew and his friends were outnumbered, but they had the advantage of surprise and position. They fought with the desperation of men defending their homes, their families, their very way of life. The gunfight raged for what felt like an eternity. Matthew fought like a man possessed, his rifle spitting fire. Beside him, Kitlali was reloading for him, her movements quick and efficient, her face set with a grim determination. They were a team, a unit. In the midst of the chaos, he saw the leader of the gunmen making a run for the barn. He was going to try and flank them. "Cover me!" Matthew yelled to Tom. He vaulted out of the trench and sprinted across the yard, bullets kicking up dust around his feet. He burst into the barn just as the gunman was climbing the ladder to the loft. They saw each other at the same time. The gunman fired, the bullet whizzing past Matthew's ear and splintering the wood behind him. Matthew fired back. His shot was true. The gunman grunted, clutching his chest, and tumbled from the ladder to the hay-strewn floor below. It was over. The remaining gunmen, their leader dead, lost their nerve. They broke and fled, riding for their lives. The silence that fell over the ranch was deafening, broken only by the whimpering of wounded horses and the ringing in Matthew's ears. They had won. They had faced impossible odds, and they had won. Tom and his sons came out, their faces grimed with smoke and sweat. But they were alive. Matthew looked around at the devastation in his yard, and then he looked at Kitlali. She was standing there, covered in dust, her hands still shaking, but her eyes were shining. She ran to him, and for the first time, she closed the distance between them. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. He held her tight, feeling the frantic beating of her heart against his. "It's over," he whispered. "We're safe." But as he held her, he knew it wasn't just about safety anymore. The lonely, broken man who had found a frightened girl in his barn was gone. In his place was a man who had found something to fight for, something to live for. He had found his heart again, right here in the middle of a battlefield. In the aftermath, Judge Carson, armed with Kitlali's ledger and the testimony of the captured gunman, issued a warrant for the arrest of Silas Blackwood. The man's empire of crime crumbled, his name becoming a curse in the territory he once ruled. The bounty was gone. The threat was over. Life at the Silent Heart Ranch slowly returned to normal, but it was a new kind of normal. The barn was repaired, but Kitlali never slept there again. She moved into the house, into the room next to Matthew's. The invisible wall between them was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding bond. They were still careful with each other, respectful of the scars they both carried. But now their silences were filled with shared smiles. Their evenings on the porch were filled with quiet conversation. He taught her how to ride, how to work the land. She taught him how to laugh again. She filled the silent house with life, with warmth, with hope. One evening, months later, they were standing by the corral, watching the sunset, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors as the day they first met. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly, her gaze on the horizon. "Marrying a stranger, tying your life to all this danger?" He turned to look at her. Her hair was no longer tangled, her eyes no longer haunted. She was beautiful. She was whole. He reached out and took her hand, their fingers lacing together as if they had been made to fit. "Never," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. "Saving you, it was the best thing I've ever done. Because in the end, I think you're the one who saved me." She finally looked at him, her dark eyes searching his. The last of the fear was gone, replaced by a love that was as deep and vast as the Texas sky above them. "I'm not afraid anymore, Matthew," she whispered. He smiled, a true, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I know," he said. He leaned in and, for the first time, he kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of promise. A promise of a future built not on a desperate contract, but on a love that had been forged in fire and had proven to be stronger than any fear. They had found each other in the darkness, two broken souls, and together they had found their way back into the light. If you enjoyed this story of courage, survival, and unexpected love, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next story. Let me know in the comments below what you think Matthew and Kitlali named their first child. Thanks for watching.